Yeah, try me now.
Is that coming through?
Test, test, test. Yeah, I see me. I see it on the pad. I see it on the pad. Oh, yeah, whoa. Yeah, when I can hear me, it's bad. Are we streaming yet? John, are we streaming? We are. We're streaming. Okay. You know, I keep turning to find Joshua 24 in Judges, and it's not there. Yeah. Kept going to Ruth. I'm like, where's chapter 24? Wrong book. Oh, boy. Jonathan's got a mic, and John's got a mic. Just a reminder that for those at home, we're trying to make sure our comments are into a microphone, so raise your hand, and we're getting better at that. I know that's just a real change in behavior, but it will become normal eventually. And for those who wonder, we're going to continue streaming our classes, so that needs to continue. And that will be good for anybody of us that are out of town and miss a class. We can always go back. Everybody, a lot of times people ask, or do you record? And we are now. So, but it will be the class in the auditorium that will be streamed, not when we start another class. It will not be both classes. Let's start with a prayer. Caleb, hand that mic to Caleb, Jonathan, and Caleb's going to lead us in prayer, and then we'll get started.
Dear God, we come to you now, thankful for the opportunity to take a reprieve from our daily lives and to be here and to just, not necessarily to escape, but to refuel and recharge and to come out of this better than we were before and help us to stay focused and to take something from this lesson and to apply it to our lives and to be better servants because of it. And please be with Terry as he delivers it and help us to have good active participation and to not only get something out of it, but to give something into it. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
So for those who aren't here, I'll give you two things you're missing by not being here. One is a clean-shaven Scott Vincent, which is the first time in how many years? 15 years. So if you'd like to see that on Sunday, we'd encourage you to show up. It is different. I'll just leave the rest of the comments private. Second thing you're missing is Garrett West is home, and it's good to see him. So we're thankful for that. Joshua 24, and verses 14 and 15. As Joshua knows that his time is coming to an end, and he is also led the conquest as far as he's going to lead it. And one of the interesting things about the historical, just from a historical perspective, is that Joshua leaves this in the hands of the people, and by the way, they fail. A good illustration of that is that Jerusalem stays in the Canaanite hands until the days of David. But Joshua reminds them of their covenant and their responsibilities. And in verse 14, starting part of that, now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's, by the way, fairly interesting that there seems to be, from Joshua, somewhat of a polytheistic charge against the forefathers of Israel here. I think it's not beyond the realm of reason to understand that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob probably did not practice the monotheism we think they did. But here, Joshua, and really since the Ten Commandments, which by the way will be our focus on Sunday, the law of Moses specifically. But here, Joshua says, I'm going to choose to serve the Lord. What do you think of that statement? is the first question. What do you think of that statement that as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord? And does a father have a right to speak that way? That's another question at the top. And why would we even ask that question? Why is that an issue? So let me just throw it out there. I got guys with mics. You raise your hand and add your participation to that. So, what do you think of it? Can a father have the right to speak that way? And why would this even be an issue? All right, we got Vincent. Somebody else be brave. Raise your hand and John will get you a mic.
Well, I mean, as far as, is it appropriate for him in this context? Was it appropriate for him to say that? And yeah, it sure was. And, it's kind of like I was always taught. I mean, you have to take a stand at some point in your life.
Yeah.
And Joshua did. What a significant stand he took. This is what we're going to do. It's my family.
Okay. Anybody else? I can tell you when I was growing up, there was no question where we were going to be on Sunday morning if we lived in my dad's house. And I don't know if any of your parents said it this way, but my dad would say, as long as your feet are under my table and you live under my roof, you're going to do what I tell you. And one of those things was, you're going to be at church. And I will tell you that in my house, if you didn't go to church, you had better been deathly ill. And if you weren't, it would be found out. And that also meant that if we didn't go to church on Sunday, we didn't do anything, right? And so those were the rules that I grew up in. Now, those were not, from that sense, it was not, my dad used to say this is a dictatorship. Now, he would say that, but it wasn't that he was a dictator in the sense that he did not explain the reasoning for all of this. And the reason why I use my dad is that most of you know my dad died when I was 16, that when it came time to design his stone to mark his grave, it was easy to know what was going to be on it. And it is this verse. Because that was his stance. And he was active, by the way. He was a Bible class teacher. Half my library that I still have in book form was his, that I inherited. So he didn't just speak this, he walked the walk, in other words. He led by example. And I think Josh was doing that too. The other thing that came to mind with me is just to think about, I don't know if you thought about this, a lot of the heroes and characters of the Old Testament, some of the more notable ones, what do we know about their kids a lot of times? A lot of their kids were terrible. And we can even look at somebody like David, and we can be pretty critical of his sons and say, and I think there's some accuracy to this, David wasn't the best father out there. By the way, neither was Samuel. His sons did not walk in his way. Gideon's sons follow in his worst qualities instead of his best. I mean, there's story after story after story. Solomon, son Rehoboam. I mean, here, think about Solomon. Here we have all this wisdom, right? He makes up a large percentage of the wisdom literature, and his kid was not wise. Listened to the wrong people. But what do you know about Joshua's kids? Truthfully, we don't even know that he had any. There's some speculation that he only had daughters. I would tell you that his statement here seems to imply that there are at least children involved, my house. And beyond that, I would tell you that I think, just based on the way the rest of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is recorded, if his children had not lived up to this, we would have heard about it, like we do with Samuel and David and others. And so I would seem to think there's an implication here that his kids did follow through with this. But this is really more about just his commitment. We're going to talk about some things in a minute and then apply them to shepherding. Why would we even ask the question, is it appropriate? Have you thought about that culturally today? Think about today. What if a parent said, what if somebody heard me say, well, I'll tell you what, my kids, I don't care what else y'all do, but my kids are going to go to church, they're going to serve God no matter what. How's that kind of a statement viewed today? I got a hand raised up here, so Gina, let's get a mic to her. Anybody else? Well, how's that kind of statement viewed in our society today?
So many parents today, leave it to their children to make decisions. Nowadays, from everything from their gender to however they want to live, and what's morally correct and what's not, and they don't use the Bible or God's Word for a basis for any of it.
Sure. Yeah, great comment. Caleb.
Yeah, to kind of go along with that, I would say those type of people, if that's the way you want to phrase it.
Those people.
Yeah. There's a way better phrase. But they would say don't push religion on your children. But at the same time, along with what Gina was saying, as far as like things like gender and stuff like that, a lot of times you'll see they're pushing those, again, for lack of a better word, liberal ideas within children of, hey, gender's just a concept. You can be whatever you want. They push and push and push and things like that. But as far as religion and other things like that, don't you dare push that on your children.
Yeah, which speaks to a truth, by the way. Here's something you need to understand about parenthood, fatherhood, motherhood, all that. You're going to influence your kids some direction on things, whether you're trying to or not. Now, you might say, well, we're not going to push religion, but what you're going to end up pushing on them is a mindset of not pushing religion. That's what you're going to influence them towards. You're going to influence your children in some way. And I've seen that probably more so with my middle child than even my oldest at this point, because for those who don't know, I don't like to watch the news. I'm not a fan of politics, especially mainstream politics. I just don't like it. And I'm very much more of what you would consider to the right of being very moderate, okay? And in the process of that, what's funny is Jillian will come home, and I can tell that without us talking about that, she's been influenced that same way. Not that I'm pushing that, right? Because, by the way, I was pushed differently as a kid. But even if you don't talk about things, your kids pick up on your position, and they start to head that direction. And when they don't, it's often a rebellion to the position that you're in, and that's another whole subject. Now, as a father, do I feel like sometimes I need to be very careful about how I lead my kids, and rather than just saying, here's what you're going to do without any explanation and just kind of this forceful dictatorship? That's not what we're suggesting here. But part of parenthood is to say, like Joshua does, here's what our commitment is. And this is what we're going to do as a family. Now, if Peyton's 21, and if I say, hey, here's what we're going to do, he has a choice to not do it. Okay? And I have a choice whether to let him live at home still after that. There's lots of choices involved in that. And I'm not saying, by the way, that would be the end result. But the point here is that in our society, it's not okay to be a little bit committed to some position about something. But you still are. You're still going to teach. It's just like if, you want to teach tolerance by not being committed, then you're going to teach your kids to be tolerant of everything. You're still going to influence them one way or another. Now, that does not mean that you then become this dictator who's, always a my way or the highway kind of guy. Tonight's not a lesson on parenting per se. But I do think that there is something here. And we'll talk about, kind of in the second half, about the influences around us. And I think we'll get into a little bit more of that before we do that. There's really only 2 slides tonight, by the way. And this is the first one. Here's the second one. Because this is really going to be the remainder of what we talk about, these 5 things. And if you did your lesson, you know that on page 42, he talks about these 5 things in regards to Joshua, and then page 43, he transitions that into leadership today, specifically in the church, but also in the home and in everywhere. So, what? Just quickly to kind of set the stage with Joshua, and then I think that's the least amount of time we want to spend comparatively to the second page here. What danger would Joshua have been concerned about? What dangers would he be concerned about? What did you put down for that? Okay, got a mic up here to Daryl.
I think he would be concerned about those that would fall in the land, that would fall victim to those around them and go back into idol worship, might be.
Yeah, I think specifically in this statement, that's very much what he's talking about. Although I would tell you what's interesting is the context of this statement doesn't just talk about the people around you, but talks about the influence of your ancestry. These are the gods of your fathers as well. And so he's afraid they're going to drift back into this idol worship. And so that would then lead them away from the Lord, okay? Secondly, how does the world look on a man who has the courage to think for himself? Because that's what we have here with Joshua, is he courageously stands up and he has this own kind of thought. How does the world look on a man who thinks for himself? Which is an interesting question, by the way, when you really think about it today. Okay, they're dangerous. Don't fit in. All right. You're offending them. Okay. What's that? Chauvinist. Okay. Yeah.
Not politically correct.
Radical, not politically correct. Okay.
They assume because you're not going with the majority that you don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, assume that because you're not going majority, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, remember to raise our hands. We've forgotten, we got out of that. One words I can repeat. You get past 3, I start struggling. Yes. Caleb, you gonna wave me off now?
I felt like the moment passed. Was fine. I was just going to say, you could be viewed as either a hero or as a villain, depending on what side of the coin you fall on, whatever the issue may be.
Here's what's really funny about the way we answer those questions as far as current culture is it's kind of rare for people to think for themselves today. Because we think we're thinking for ourselves when a lot of times we've just put ourselves into an echo chamber with people that agree with us, right? Because the guy that actually has some weird oddball position where he's thought for himself, he kind of gets rejected by everybody. That's the guy that actually has the courage to think for himself. And let me just say, a political cycle we just came out of is the perfect time to see this. It's because what happens is a lot of people think that they're thinking for themselves, but they're really just regurgitating one side of the political aisle. And because their friends are mad at them, they view that as them thinking for themselves, when a lot of times, honestly, they're not thinking for themselves, they're repeating the same thing. And that's not meant to be as critical as it sounds. It's just, we need to think. One of the things about Christianity is you're not going to fit in. And I will tell you that thinking for yourself, nonconformity, serving the Lord, which is all rooted in nonconformity, should mean that sometimes we do feel like we're the only one. We should have Elijah moments where we feel like we are the only one who's speaking up and saying anything. And in our culture, that probably isn't as prevalent as we think it is. So I think that's one of the interesting things here about all of that. True thinking for yourself is a rarity. It's a rare thing. And I'll be honest, for those of you that grew up in a very orthodox kind of approach to the church, people who thought for themselves usually were very much criticized for thinking for themselves. Because when you don't hold the party line, so to speak, then a lot of times it's get back in line kind of thing. So just think about that a little bit. And when you think about what Josh was doing here. personal suggestion for all of us. Part of that means we need to get out of our echo chambers a little bit. Conviction to stand alone. Why is it so hard to stand alone? Okay, I got Daryl. Jonathan, if you get a mic there. Anybody else want to add once Daryl's done? Daryl?
I think one reason is a fear of being rejected. We want to be liked.
Okay. Yep, I'd agree with that. Anybody else? Dave, I need a mic to Dave.
I think the fear of facing ridicule or perhaps verbal or physical persecution.
Okay. Yep, Jonathan?
I think maybe part of it too is the confidence to know that we are right, and that
Okay.
goes back a little bit to thinking for ourselves that if everyone else is telling us we are wrong, it's hard to have that confidence that we're right and to make that stand.
Yeah. These two things, courage to think and conviction to stand, carry with them a tremendous amount of peer pressure. And especially, by the way, if you stand up for something, and let's say you stand up for something your family doesn't agree with, there's a tremendous amount of family pressure. And you think about how that feels, and it's easier sometimes to just conform to what everybody wants rather than to stand up and to be yourself and stand for what you believe in. Joshua also shows a commitment to influence others. Who is he committed to influence here, by the way? His family, okay? And his commitment to influence his family, by the way, he is using as a secondary influence to influence Israel. But his commitment was primarily in this statement, in these two verses, to his family. And then, can he guarantee that his family will follow God? Can Joshua, when he makes a statement, can he guarantee his family's going to do this? Nope. Nope. So what's this really about? What's he doing? If he can't guarantee it, Daryl, what's he doing when he makes this statement?
Trying to influence them by setting an example.
Okay. Setting an example. Anybody else? There's a verbal commitment that now he is saying he's going to hold them accountable to this verbal commitment. When it comes to my kids, I can't guarantee they're going to be faithful, but I guarantee you this, I'm going to do everything within my power to influence them to be faithful. And I think that is the kind of sentiment of what we see here. Now, the family leaders question at the bottom, would you all think that Joshua, these kind of qualities make him a good family leader? I mean, I would think so. I think that certainly does. So let's talk about these things in regards to the shepherds of the flock. And some of these questions are pretty open-ended, but I mean, the first one, what dangers does the church face today? And this question is like, when you become a preacher, one of the questions you get asked all the time is, well, what do you think the next big issue the church is facing? So I know this question here is pretty open-ended, so I'm looking forward to some responses to what you think. What is the dangers does the church face today? Raise your hand. Don't be afraid. Okay, Chuck's going to speak. Oh, it's a West convention. Garrett gets the mic first because he's closest to one.
Apathy.
Apathy. That's a great one. Good one.
I put down worldliness from within.
Worldliness from within. Okay. Another good one. Somebody else. Surely we have more than two, and those are great. We can add to that. I got Jason back here.
I think one thing that I could think of is the church becoming too relevant to the world to influence.
Okay. Yeah. Caleb, and then John.
I know for me personally, the thing that I struggle with is things consuming my time. As the
Okay.
world progresses and technology progresses and so on and so forth, there's so much more things to do, to not be bored and so on and so forth. And for me personally, I'm always doing something, listening to something, whatever the case may be, and not spending my time as productively as I should.
Okay. John?
In the story of the prodigal son, both the brothers were lost.
Yep.
I'm not concerned about members of the church so much being the younger brother. I'm concerned about us being the older brother.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Scott Vincent?
I mean, materialism
Yeah.
and the idea of entertainment.
Okay. Yep. Megan Junkin needs a mic. Is she? I like how Megan plays like.
Something that I've thought about lately is the urgency to share the gospel, the concern for others, and just and sometimes I think in the effort to not be so rigid in what we believe, sometimes we may be a little bit less urgent in our concern to teach others truth. And so I think there's a good line there. I think we need to, find that line, and we need to remember the urgency.
Yeah, it's a great thought. All great thoughts. Daryl, John, Daryl.
Again, I say political correctness again, falling victim to what the morals of the world are today and the things that contradict the Bible.
Okay.
That's going to be hard to, like Megan said, we tend to soft pedal on those maybe a little bit. We shouldn't, but perhaps maybe we do.
Okay. Some of the things I thought about just quickly, immediately what came to mind was our James study and just the whole point of James about how these Jewish Christians were failing in a lot of ways to act practically on their faith, which I think incorporates a lot of what we were saying. I thought specifically of that section at the end of chapter 1, which those three things we've talked about repeatedly, but the idea of self-control is illustrated with the tongue and anger, reaching out and caring for those who are need, the poor and the helpless, illustrated there by the orphans and widows, and then to keep yourself unspotted from the world, abstaining from immorality. Other things, and I could I could go through a host of things where there's a spectrum, and both sides of the spectrum are dangerous. One of those could be, I think traditionalism is very much a danger, but I also think that modernism is very much a danger too if you're not careful. And I could go through all of that, right? I could go through, Megan brings up a great point that we need to be very focused on outreach and on mission, but not to the detriment that we're not facing inwardly and taking care of the edification that's required either. All of which is to say that what is missing in much of what you said is just having balance in our approach to these things. And I think that's a big concern of mine, is the balance. And I think a lot of that, though, comes from this, which is the ultimate concern is that if we're not careful, church becomes about us and not about God. And I think that's the greatest danger to a lot of what was said. And by the way, historically, when you read through the Hebrew Bible, that was their failure, wasn't it? They stopped focusing on pleasing God. And they focused on self. So, and we could go on and on and on about a lot of those things. By the way, false doctrine is always a danger too. And that's one of the things he mentions there from Acts 20. And one of the things that's always interesting about that text from Acts 20, verses 28 through 31, is that he says that there will be wolves that will come in among the flock. But what was the most interesting statement he makes about those wolves in that context? Do you remember what that is? Okay, they're wolves in sheep's clothing, but
They're going to rise from within themselves.
yeah, from within the elders, he says, even from among you, this could happen. By the way, I know of a specific situation where that happened, and the end result was a terrible division in the church. And so that as well is part of this. So anything to add to all that? I mean, there could be a lot of dangers there. Courage to think for himself. What factors make it difficult, and this is for a shepherd, to think independently? What factors make it? I should just have the three shepherds answer that probably, and just put them on the spot. But Jonathan's already moving to Scott. Hey, you've been in an auction. You know what happens when you scratch your head. That means you got the winning bid, buddy.
All right.
Joe next. He just wiggled his ears, so he gets a mic too.
Okay, all right. Splitting the eldership.
Yeah.
That's a big factor that you could be worried with, or splitting the church, as you've talked about.
Right.
You know, there are a lot of factors that I would say encompass that, but I'll leave the rest of that to Joe.
Okay, Joe. He dumped it in your lap there.
Well, difficulty to think independently has not really been a charge that I've received, but
I wasn't going to say that, but
if I could circle back, just one thing that's kind of overarching in all that is that there's no vision.
Yeah.
And when there's a lack of vision, we muddle around.
Yep.
And we turn in circles, and we do all kinds of things. We even do things that we think that are productive, but they're not headed anywhere. We don't have a vision of who we're going to be because of him. Yep. And we don't have as a result, we don't have a vision for the church where it's going to be serving him.
That's the difference in an elder leading from the rear versus leading from the front. Proactive versus reactive. I think, by the way, Daryl,
My turn?
Yeah, your turn. What makes it hard to think independently?
If you think independent, the others may not agree with you, and they're going to argue that point, or, you know, I hate to say argue because we don't argue. We've been committed to coming to a decision that we all can agree upon.
Right.
And if you think too independently, others may, you know, look at you and frown upon that thought.
Yep. I kind of hinted this earlier, but there's a tremendous amount of pressure to follow along groupthink today. And by the way, I think there's a tremendous, and that's manifested itself in a lot of ways. Just from a very, very high view, there's a tremendous amount of pressure to think a certain way about certain things if you claim to be a Christian versus if you claim not to be a Christian. There just is. And that's an illustration, by the way, that's not specific to the eldership, but that's just a general illustration. You take whatever issue you want, and you know how that falls in line. And so there's just this tremendous amount of pressure to kind of fall in line. And I do think, by the way, that one of those tremendous pressures for shepherds today is our tradition. That, and I know, Scott, you're going to say something, but just let me finish this, and I'll be the one to say this over the World Wide Web and take the heat. There's a part of us as the Church of Christ where there's this kind of established but unwritten paradigm that's been there, and you're not supposed to question that. And this whole idea of thinking for yourself means, and this is a good activity, by the way, that to some degree we should all go through those things individually and question every one of those things. But again, the pressure to fall in line, to fit the mold, to conform, that's a pressure that you have in any leadership position in the church. And by the way, that's a pressure that is not unique to the quote-unquote Church of Christ. That is a pressure for any leader in any organization, religious or non-religious, to carry on its traditional views and perspective and not question those things. So that's not unique to shepherds, but that is the challenge. Scott?
I mean, really, you kind of summed it up. It's a viewpoint. It's, you know, if you're committed to thinking independently, you have to, you have to be willing and courageous enough to do that.
Yeah.
And step out of the box and think about it. I'm not saying what may have been taught previously is wrong. I'm saying I need to think about it from every angle, and I need to do what God wants me to do when I see it in the end, and we've prayed about it and we've gone through it, not just because somebody else says this is the way you're supposed to do it. And so you're right. And I think that I'll go a step further. I think that some of our secular organizations that we have placed emphasis of the church into and that kind of stuff, while that's great and all wonderful, I think that it's been shoved down a lot of people's throats inappropriately.
Yep. Caleb, while I was getting the mic, let me say this too, that in your questioning of those things, that means to also consider those things. I am not suggesting that when you question something that we've done traditionally, and I'll give a good example of that, which is I was raised going to church twice on Sunday, okay? And I was part of a discussion that ended up going to one time in Memphis, and then I'm at a place that only meets one time on Sunday now, and you all don't realize that, but as a preacher, then you become this only once on Sunday guy, and then you start getting phone calls because you're one of the only once on Sunday guys. And those phone calls could be one of two things. It could be you defending why you're an only once on Sunday guy, which is kind of funny because I'm not an only once on Sunday guy. Okay? Just happens to be where I preach. Or some of those phone calls are from the twice on Sunday guy that really wants to be the only once on Sunday guy but's too scared to do it. And then wants you to give him the data and the ammo to do it. Okay? And you know what really I am? I'm a guy who believes in the autonomy of local churches to decide when and how many times they're going to meet. And when it comes to that, how many times Chelsea meets and what time? It's nobody else's business but Chelsea's. If they want to meet 5 times on Sunday, then that's fine. You're going to need another preacher. But to share the load, I'm not leaving. I'm not going to preach 5 times. I'm kidding. Caleb?
I mean, yeah, you're starting to touch on basically what I was going to say. I grew up as a preacher's kid. I still am a preacher's kid.
But you are grown up.
I am grown up. I have children of my own, but
yep.
Technically I am still the son of a preacher, man. So, I was always told exact same thing you were told. There's church, you're going to be there, so on and so forth. And I, by far, between my sisters and myself, was the most rebellious one to my demise at certain times. But I think one of the things that I did that was good, and I'm not saying my sisters didn't do it because they did, mine just may have been more apparent or showy, or whatever the case may be, between myself and my parents, was I began to question things for myself. And speaking to what you were saying as far as like the unwritten rules that really aren't there, as far as like scheduling or schedules within schedules, or there's a certain way we all do the same thing, or we should, but there's a certain way that you have to do it.
Right.
But there's not, that kind of a thing. And so, my early 20s, whatever the case may be, I went to what you might call a more liberal church, not an institutional church, but a church that did things differently. Mm-hmm. And I don't regret that at all. I enjoyed my time there. I learned a lot and grew and so on and so forth. But for myself, I figured things out for myself. And I thought, okay, am I doing this just to change for change's sake? or am I doing it for the better of myself,
Yeah.
for my wife, so on and so forth. So all that to say, I think change is important if it's necessary and if it's needed, and I apply that to my work life as well. But changing just for change's sake isn't always the best decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I got Joe and Malachi. Malachi's got the mic first, and so he'll talk, and then Joe. Malachi?
Yeah, I was raised Sunday morning, you got to wear a suit and tie every day. And eventually I grew up and got to the age where I'm like, I don't enjoy having a piece of fabric choking me. You know, it's not a pleasant thing. And is this piece of fabric going to help me worship better? You know, so
Yeah.
I don't know. And then people are like, well, you got to wear your best. And I was like, well, if you got a tux in my closet, do I need to be wearing a tux every morning? Or is that to where we're getting to be immodest because we're too fancy or whatever? So, I eventually gave that up. So now I've got like 3 suits in my closet with like an inch of dust on the shoulder pads. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because in Memphis, I had people that would come because we were very diverse, and they would have on their Air Jordans and jeans that were, pretty expensive, and their polo, and somebody would complain they're not in a suit, and I'm like, but those Jordans cost more than that suit you bought on clearance. So when you're talking about your best, like, what does that mean, Joe?
Thinking independently requires a lot of effort. You got to spend a lot of time. If you're just going to go along, and really that, when I was growing up, that's really my nature. My nature is to trust authority and accept authority and go along. But what I figured out along the way was, if I'm listening to somebody else and I'm not developing my faith, then what am I really doing? Yep. And I'm putting my trust in somebody else rather than putting my trust in what the Lord is telling me through His Word. Yep. And there was another wake-up call, and that is the group that we call the Church of Christ is a declining group. And why is that? Why is that? And I started questioning what are the things that impede us growing? Because we've got the greatest message that mankind has ever heard. And why are we not growing? And it just hit me that there's something standing in the way of me telling the message that this is the greatest thing ever, ever, and living in such a way that that message is acceptable, is received. Does that? And that's a lot of stuff to chew on. But that
sure it is. We're never going to get done. I'm going to extend class 5 minutes longer, and the teachers aren't going to know that till the end of that. So.
My fault.
Yeah, no, it's my fault. Which, by the way, that's been a discussion we've had anyway about maybe long term. Let me throw this about standing and tradition and all that, and move on, and we'll just wrap up a couple other things. I'll let you peek into me. One of the first conversations I think Chris and Dave and I had, maybe within 6 months of me moving here, was getting rid of the collection trays and having a box and just dropping your check in the box. And the decision was made at that time not to do that, largely because the way people would respond, because that wasn't our tradition. Well, obviously, COVID comes through and it changes our tradition, and guess what the decision now is? I don't know if y'all realize this, but we ain't passing trays no more. But here's what's funny is some of the most traditional groups I know, they're not passing trays either. Because what happened in some of I'm saying this to say this is a blessing of the last year we need to be aware of. It was a way to force us to rethink everything. And some people who've never had the courage to rethink some of these things were forced into that. All we're saying is we should have the courage to do that on our own and not have something like a virus force us to rethink some of our traditional practices. Conviction to stand, I'm going to skip the first question there and get to the one that is important, which is, in a democracy, where does authority come from? People. And in a kingdom, in the kingdom, or in a kingdom, where does the authority come from? The king. And who is our king? Jesus, ultimately. One of our issues when it comes to standing up, and especially for leaders, and one of the challenges they face, just to be blunt, is that we think the church is a democracy. And it is not. That doesn't mean that leaders should ignore the flock. But every image of shepherding is leading from the front and the flock following. It is not the shepherd turning around and asking the flock where they want to go. Which, by the way, with sheep would be mass chaos, right? So, from that standpoint, that's something that we have to fight as sheep in regards to our shepherd, thinking this is a democracy. And what that ultimately means for them is while they stand on behalf of the king or the chief shepherd, to use the shepherding imagery. And that's what they have to fulfill first and foremost. As we just kind of move on, we'll take, like I said, we'll go a little over. Commitment to influence others. Ephesians 4:11 through 16, that's really what that is saying there, is that these roles specifically, for us today, obviously apostles, prophets, the first two, we kind of skip over to evangelists, pastors or shepherds, and teachers. They have a responsibility to influence the flock, the saints, to equip them for the ministry. So there's an influence there, a leadership to equip them, to help them grow and mature and become perfect, which there doesn't mean blameless, but the idea of adequate or complete. To edify them, to build them up. That's their primary thing. And we've talked about this, but it's important to point out that none of that has to do with watching the budget. Right? That's not what that is. Somebody else can take care of that. None of that has to do with making sure the parking lot is sealed and protecting the investment. Somebody else can take care of that. When it comes to the shepherds, their role is to influence us to be active in the work, to grow, to mature, to serve God, to follow the chief shepherd. That's their job. That's their commitment there. And in a sense, like they have with their own families, that they would make a commitment that we as a family at Chelsea, a spiritual family, are going to serve the Lord, and they're going to lead us in doing so. That's the idea there. Should a shepherd be hesitant, this is the final one, to say that this congregation is going to be faithful to God? Should we be hesitant to say that? No. What are some things quickly, and I'll just throw these out there, and maybe you have more, we just have time. If our three shepherds are going to say that, what are they going to have to do to be able to make sure that happens? Well, let me tell you, the first thing they have to do is they're going to have to know the sheep. You can't make that kind of commitment if you don't know the sheep and who they are and what their lives are like and what they face and what their temptations are. If you're going to shepherd the flock of God, you have to actually know the flock of God. By the way, that's where things like small groups, I think, are so vital to us, is to get, even in a smaller setting, to this, which is great, and the participation has been great, but to even get on a closer level and even a more one-on-one level. Also, to speak positively to the sheep. I think that, by the way, is just so important. And in the process of speaking positive, that they don't belittle, they don't shame. I was joking around, said something about the shame and honor culture, and Joe said, so hard to break out of. And if you've never looked into the shame honor culture, it is heavily prevalent in the South, by the way. We're built on it. It's a hard thing to break out of, and especially in the religious setting, it's a hard thing to not focus on. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't times where I should be ashamed. I mean, there's still those passages that talk about Israel losing their ability to blush. But that is different from constantly shaming and using fear tactics to lead. And rather than do that, it is a positive leadership. It is walking from the front. And the final thing there is, if our 3 shepherds are going to say, hey, we are going to be faithful, then they've got to be the ones proactively to have vision to lead us in that. You can't make that statement, then sit on the back row and wait to see what happens. And the thing you got to understand about a congregation being faithful is you don't just speak that into existence. You lead that by example. That's how that happens. So we're just out of time. Great conversation tonight. Thank you so much for helping.